There once lived a king, and he cut a fine figure because he always wore wonderful clothes fashioned from the finest and most expensive silks. But one thing the king wasn't so good at was governing his country, and the reason for that was simple. He preferred to spend his time listening to tales, listening to stories. He had many storytellers who lived at the palace with him, and that king would listen to stories morning, noon and night. He'd listen to stories while he was eating, and he'd listen to stories while he should have been governing his country. And in time, the storytellers began to run out of new stories to tell the king. And when they did, he'd say, "Oh, I've heard that one before. Take this storyteller to the dungeon." And those poor storytellers were thrown into the dungeon if they couldn't come up with more and more new stories. And after a time, each and every one of the royal storytellers was imprisoned in the dungeon. And the king sent his armies to war and told them to come back with stories as well as spoils. And he sent his merchants to far-flung corners of the earth and told them to come back with tales as well as merchandise, and his scholars to the dustiest books in the darkest corners of the libraries of the land, and told them to translate what they found and to bring them back. And they did. But after a time, even those stories began to dry up, and the king's mood was dark. And then one day, he had an idea. He said, "What I need is a storyteller who can tell me a never-ending story, a storyteller that goes beyond the end of the rainbow, beyond the stars, a storyteller who can tell me a tale that doesn't have an end. And that would keep me happy. And if such a man can be found, then I will give him half of my kingdom." And many storytellers came, but when they read the small print, the clause right at the bottom of the king's proclamation, and saw that if they failed they would be thrown in the dungeon, they didn't even bother trying. Until one day a tatterdemalion of a man turned up, and he said, "I will try this, your highness, as long as you promise to let me tell the story in my own way and at my own speed." "Of course I promise," said the king. "Get on with it, man." And so the king was sat on his throne, and there stood the raggedy storyteller who began, "Once upon a time there lived a king as grand as you are, your highness, and that king decreed that a great granary should be built, a great stone granary, and so it was. And the walls were built of stone, and the high roof was built of stone, and it was the biggest and the grandest granary in the land. And come the harvest, the king decreed that every grain of wheat should be stored in that granary to protect the land from times of famine, and it was. And when the wheat was reaching the ceiling of the granary, the king decreed that the door should be sealed up, and it was. And that might have been the end of the story," went on the storyteller, but no, because there in one of the walls of the granary was a tiny little crack, a little dark nick, invisible almost to the human eye, but not to the eye of an ant. And a passing ant happened to see it. And he called for his brothers and his sisters, and soon all the ground that surrounded the granary was alive with a moving carpet of black, feisty ants. And one of those ants went into the crack, and when he came out he had a wheat grain on his back. And another ant went into the crack, and when he came out he had a wheat grain on his back. And another ant went into the crack, and when he came out he had a wheat grain on his back. And another ant went into the crack, and when he came out he had a wheat grain on his back. And the storyteller continued for an hour and more, and eventually the king said, "Stop! I have heard enough of ants and wheat grains. Tell me, what happened to the granary? What happened to the king?" And the storyteller said, "Your highness, you promised me that I could tell this story in my own time and in my own way, and how can you have the end of the story before you've even had the beginning and the middle? And believe me, we're not past the beginning yet. There were millions of grains of wheat and millions of ants waiting to carry them out." And the king had to agree that he had indeed made that promise, and the storyteller continued. And another ant went into the crack, and when he came out he had a wheat grain on his back. And another ant went into the... "Stop," said the king. "Stop. Continue tomorrow. I've had enough of this tale for now." And the king slept very well that night. And the next day the storyteller continued, and the day after, and the day after, and the week after, and the month after, and another ant went into the crack, and when he came out he had a wheat grain on his back, until one day the king said, "Stop! You have indeed got a never-ending story, and I will give you your due reward, half of my kingdom." And so it happened. And the king, because he'd been growing tired of that story, had spent more time thinking about governing his country, and so things were a bit better in the land. And then the king decided to set free all his storytellers from the dungeon, and when they came back and regaled him with stories, even though he may have heard them before, he really enjoyed those stories, and he never asked the tatterdemalion storyteller to tell him any more of ants nor of grains of wheat, but he let him share in the governing of his kingdom, and I can tell you that they governed it very well.